I'm Phil Rickaby, and I've been a writer and performer for almost 30 years. But I've realized that I don't really know as much as I should about the theater scene outside of my particular Toronto bubble. Now, I'm on a quest to learn as much as I can about the theater scene across Canada. So join me as I talk with mainstream theater creators you may have heard of and indie artists you really should know, as we find out just what it takes to be stage-worthy. If you value the work that I do on Stageworthy, please consider leaving a donation either as a one-time thing or on a recurring monthly basis. Stageworthy is created entirely by me, and I give it to you free of charge with no advertising or other sponsored messages. Your continuing support helps me to cover the cost of producing and distributing the show. Just 4 people donating $5 a month would help me cover the cost of podcast hosting alone. Help me continue to bring you this podcast. You can find a link to donate in the show notes, which you can find in your podcast app or at the website at stageworthy.ca. Now, on to the show. Stevie Baker is a director, producer, and costume designer, as well as head of production for Dauntless City Theatre. She's also director on the boards of Arts Orillia and Mariposa Arts Theatre. She joined me to talk about relocating from Toronto during the pandemic, finding community after moving, producing Toronto productions from out of town, and much more. Here's our conversation. Stevie, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. One thing I was thinking about the fact that we kind of have been peripheral to each other. You've worked with my friend Adriana Prosser on her first solo show. You've worked on some friends of mine. You were the stage manager for Night Feed. You've worked with Dauntless, and I've known a few people on that. So we've known each other peripherally for quite some time, and this is our first time being able to chat. How do you describe what you do, your artistic practice or your focus?
I would say that at this point in my career, my focus is primarily producing and directing. Before the pandemic, I was doing a lot of costume designing, and I did do that again this summer with Dauntless's most recent show, This Earth of Majesty, which was great. But I haven't done it so much. But I mean, that's kind of the pandemic. We're sort of just easing back in. I've done 4 shows this year, but that's after a very dry couple of years.
With those dry, I mean, we've all had the dry couple of years, and we've all done. For a second, I said we've all done things we're not proud of, but you know what? We've all done things, and you know what? We should be proud of the things that we did. So I just want to put that out there. The things that we did creatively or otherwise. What did you have a creative outlet during the pandemic, or were you completely just focused on survival and getting through the thing?
Kind of a combo. Well, really, so much of the pandemic for me was survival for sure. We, of course, working in theater, my career really just grinded to a random halt. We ended up having to leave our apartment in Toronto and moving to Severn, where I'm from, to move in with my sister. And so it's been weird. I mean, I have 2 small kids. They're 6 and 9 now, so they did a year of virtual school. So it was really survival based. And I found myself as much as I wanted to have some sort of creative renaissance during the pandemic, which I believe is still happening, I didn't for the first 2 years of it. I am someone who sews a lot. I didn't really make anything. I don't know. It was just really, survival mode.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, let's acknowledge the pandemic is still going on, and we should all be masking and all the things that we should be doing, which some people are not. Anyway, I don't want to talk about that because that's a depressing topic. But I will say the first most of 2020 for me was full of doom scrolling. There was no creative outlet for quite a bit of it.
Yes.
It was just like, what's going on? Like that kind of like panicked survival mode. But eventually, I was able to find some creative things to do. I, however, didn't have children who needed to be virtually schooled and had to be cared for and that sort of thing. So the choice to move to Severn, was that, I mean, was it a choice or was it like we just can't do this in Toronto anymore and we need to go somewhere else?
It was really kind of that. Like, I remember when I told my parents I was moving home, like, I literally told my dad, like, "Okay, hell has frozen over, like, I am coming back," because that was never in my plans to ever move home. Yeah, so it was really like a "We can't do this." Like, we were living in a pretty small, like, windowless basement apartment in the Junction, and I mean, we it worked for us at the time when we could be outside constantly and that sort of thing, and once that became questionable, it was a problem. Um, and with 4 people in a tiny space, it was tough, and then August 2020, when we realized, like, "Oh, this is not wrapping up, and it's likely to get much worse once everyone starts, once the fall happens," and school was not sounding promising to me, so we were like, "Okay, we have to virtual school these kids, and we cannot keep them in this cave, like, 24 hours a day. It's gonna be so bad." So, it was kind of like I called my sister one day, and I was just, like, devastated, but I was like, "I think we have to come live with you." She was like, "Okay." And then, like, within a month, we were there. It was
Yeah.
really fast.
I started 2020, I was living in a basement apartment too. So I spent about a year of the pandemic in a basement apartment while also predominantly working from home. So I sort of get that, but that was just me. I can't imagine like 4 people trapped in a basement. It's not trapped in a basement, but
It felt
that's,
like it.
I'm sure it did, especially during that year of like, you barely peeking your head out and things like that. Um, as far as, you know, having your creative life while in Severn, how does that look for you these days? What does it look like now as compared to where you were?
Now it's moving into, like, a really fantastic place. About a year ago, so I'd say October 2021, one of the like, a community theater group up here, Mariposa Arts Theater, they were kind of, starting to get people together for a show, so I submitted to direct a show for them, which I did do, Steel Magnolias, and it was delayed. It was supposed to go up February 2022, and then, it eventually ended up happening in April. So yeah, that happened and that was really great. Like the actors were incredible. My stage manager felt like a pro. She felt like the kind of person I was used to working with on like Dauntless shows. It was really nice and I really connected with some of those actors. And I reached out to another group called Arts Orillia and they invited me to a few things they do. One of their main programs right now is like this dance and design residency. So a dance company will come and work with like a lighting designer or costume designer, whatever, to work on that element of a piece that they're doing. So I did that, and then I started adjudicating on their panel for that, and now um, I'm on the board for both organizations. And I just produced Rocky Horror with Mariposa Arts Theater, which went up in November and which was their most successful show in like 20 years. So now things feel a little bit like they're going somewhere. It's different um, because it's not necessarily a career in the same way. It's hard to sustain yourself doing shows here as a career, but but the work has been really good, and there are incredibly talented people up here, and, just, like, finding community has been so, so, so good.
We all need that. We all need community. I often there's sort of that idea of the theater community, quote unquote, and I often, we refer to it a lot, but I never really know what that is because we just have silos, and those, I guess, are communities, but there's no overall theater community. I would imagine in a smaller town that it could feel a little bit more like a community.
Yeah, I think so. Like here, it's interesting. Like I'm still really learning because there are like community theater is a completely different world than indie theater. Like it's so different in ways that I wouldn't have anticipated. And they're all intertwined sort of through the region. So people know the people in Bracebridge and the people in Barrie and in Innisfil and like all of these different groups. And so I'm still learning who people are. And every time I'm hanging out with someone, they're like, oh, and this person's doing this and this group's doing this. And I'm like, wait, who are these people? What do those initials stand for? What is happening? Because I'm very much a like, I want to know everybody. I want to know what's happening everywhere and kind of where I'm going to best fit. Like for me, I was so lucky in Toronto. Dauntless felt like a huge community, even though it was often, well, not always the same people, but sort of the same core people. And I guess it's just a segment of indie theater in Toronto is like all the Shakespeare people kind of know each other.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Now, as a producer, now I noticed you produced the Rocky Horror Show, but you also produced Slaughter Brothers Dime Circus, which was in Toronto. Was that a remote producing role? Were you in Severn producing a show in Toronto, or were you commuting?
So that I was in Severn. So I did come down to the city to see the show. But I was producing remotely and it was kind of stacked with This Earth of Majesty, Dauntless's show. And that show, because I was doing costumes, I was in the city far more frequently. Still not really enough, but far more frequently. And then most of Slaughter Brothers was just, yeah, virtual. And that was fine in general. That kind of work you can do remotely pretty successfully, but it was a different feeling. Like, even though I have a history with Sean Sullivan and Lynn Griffin and working with them, and, I love them so much, it still was so different. You don't feel as much a part of the group and the like family that's happening in rehearsals and things when you can't be there.
Yeah, for sure. That's I think as remote things continue in the theater world, that's definitely going to be a part of it because you're missing the moments, you're missing the things that are happening in the room. It's almost like if you're going to do remote, there has to be a camera on in the room so that like you can just sort of check in.
Yeah, yeah, right? Because so much does happen in the room. And people forget, right? Especially
Yeah.
like Slaughter Brothers Dime Circus was a really, really small group, tight knit group. Most of us had, like, I hadn't worked with everyone, but everyone had worked with Sean and Lenny, and so things would happen in rehearsal, and then I sort of hear about them down the road, and I was like, oh no, I had no idea that was a thing, which is fine, but like that's the magic of being in the room together. Is all this great stuff happens, and when you're just like at home occasionally checking your email, you're not seeing it or experiencing it.
Yeah. Yeah. For my day job for many years when we were in the office, we had an office in Berlin, and we would have company meetings, and we would have the Berlin office would uh, basically like video call in, but they would often feel forgotten because we were just talking to each other in the room, and every so often somebody would say, "Into a mic, please," just to remind us that they were there. It's so hard, even if you're doing it like we were doing this weekly, and we would still fall into that. It's like it's so hard to consistently keep in mind the remote people, and I wonder if the remoteness of the pandemic is helping us maybe do more of that since more people are remote. But again, rehearsal isn't really conducive to that. So I wonder, Are there ways that you can think of as a producer that might be able to better facilitate that moving forward as we do more remote things?
Yeah, I wonder. Like, we've done different things because I have yet to work on a show. Like, I worked on 4 shows this year, which is kind of a lot going from 0 shows. And every show had a COVID situation. Steel Magnolias, like, we started rehearsals December 2021, and we had a table read together, and then everything went crazy. And so then we had to start doing virtual rehearsals because at the time we still thought we were doing the show in February.
Right.
So doing virtual rehearsals was something that I wasn't really excited about, that nobody was really excited about, but it was interesting. Like, I find a lot of the times in my sort of rehearsal process, like, we're up and moving around pretty quickly and not necessarily sitting and doing a lot of table work because I find so much comes from moving around and interacting with each other. So with Steel Magnolias, it really flipped. And I was like, okay, well, we still have to do work. Like, we still have to be doing something. And so it was interesting without that ability to move around and be in the space together. It kind of forced us to talk a lot about character and which we always do, but like in a very different way. And I thought that that was really interesting, and we got to know each other very well and very closely because no one was excited about it. You know what I mean? It was like the thing we all had to really do together. So that was the thing. And when we did our tech, one of the well, everybody's a lead in that show. It's so small, but the woman who played Shelby was ill, and so I remember we were in the Orillia Opera House doing our tech rehearsal, and I was playing Shelby on stage, and she was watching on a laptop, and we just had her like plugged in, watching the whole time, and she was sort of in and out, and we had a microphone kind of close, so every once in a while we could interact with her, which was interesting. Like, it didn't 100% do the trick, but just sort of having for her, I think having us on in the background was helpful to still feel like they have a sense of what's happening. Um, yeah, and that happened. I feel like something else that's sort of helpful in facilitating that is like more production meetings that can have a bit of a casual element to part of them. Because if you're connecting more frequently, you may not always have a technical thing that you really need to talk about or enough to fill the time of gathering everyone, but you can chat about what's been going on and be brought into the world a little bit more, which I think is really helpful. Yeah. So I feel like on Slaughter Brothers, we had a good amount of production meetings together, which was really, really helpful because there was a lot going on with that show. Like, there was a whole
Mm.
projection design situation. And so that was great because I could see some of that. Like, we could have a Zoom meeting and they could show it to me, like, just with a screen share, which is awesome. Which is something, that would have been really difficult in the past had I not been able to go to the building.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
for sure. Um, Now you've been working with Dauntless City Theatre, which was originally Urban Bard, since 2007, and uh, you're the head of production. Where did you start with that company, and what is Dauntless City Theatre for people who might not know?
Dauntless is I feel I love Dauntless. I just feel like my smile got so huge thinking about it. It's really like my theatrical home. So Dauntless is a site-specific queer Shakespeare company, and we do immersive theater, which is sometimes referred to as ambulatory or promenade style. So basically, our primary contract is with the St. Lawrence Market Neighborhood BIA. And so we are often working in Bursey Park. This year we were in St. James Park. And with our shows, the audience moves with us. So different parts of the park may be, a palace, and another part might be another country. And so as our actors move through the scenes, they're pulling the audience to follow them to the next scene that just starts to happen as people are arriving, which is really unique and really accessible. All of our shows are pay what you can that are outdoors. And we get a lot of audience who are just walking by, like so many times, someone's just like going for a walk and then they're like, oh, what's happening? And they stay and watch the show, which is really beautiful. But we are really focused on, we've always had, well, what sort of, I guess, originally happened with the company is that we were doing sort of, which at the time in 2007, people would call like, I don't know, like gender swap casting, maybe that sort of thing, like having a female Antonio or, that sort of thing in a way that's not like sexy Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. You know what I mean? Like just casting people differently. And that moved fairly quickly into trying to have a more diverse cast, to have more Black, Indigenous, and people of color, which is something that in the past, I don't know, 5, 6, maybe 7 years, we've been very successful at. We've met a lot of incredible actors who we've been able to work with and who have gotten to play a lot of roles that they may not have otherwise. So that's really something that's important to us. And queerness is pretty much always at the core of what we do. And because it's Shakespeare and you don't have to worry about royalties or anything and you can do whatever you want, we do a lot of messing with Shakespeare. We take out bits that we think aren't serving any purpose. Like I know when we did Love's Labour's Lost, there's this whole thing with Rosaline and people being like super racist to her. She's supposed to be darker skinned like in the play. And we're like, maybe we can just like take that out. That's not helping anybody and it's not relevant to the story. And or, some of the shows that are comedies end and it's just sort of like, I still don't know that those people should have gotten together after this hot mess situation. Maybe we'll just like rework that. Maybe we'll steal something from another show and put it in and change the ending a little bit. So, and I think that that's nice. I think it keeps stories that people think of as universal, but makes them universal still. Or relevant still in a way that they may not otherwise be. Like everybody has seen all white Shakespeare and like, who cares at this point? Like hetero white Shakespeare is just like, we've been doing it for literally hundreds of years. I think we can stop.
I think that a lot of times to me, as an actor in Canada, you do a lot of Shakespeare, especially when you're younger. You just like, that's just a thing. And at a certain point, I've encountered companies that seem to just do a show because I think it would be cool to do that show. And they try to come up with a concept, and the concept does not marry with the story at all. And so you're always bumping into the story while you're trying, like the concept is bumping into the story and it doesn't work. But you can change and you can do stuff as long as it does serve the story. And that's, I think, the important thing. I think sometimes people try to get super smart, quote unquote, with their Shakespeare, and that to their detriment sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's all there and little things can make a big difference. Like this year our show was called This Earth of Majesty, and it was a rework of Richard II. And it was, it was really, really beautiful. And in our Richard II, Richard's consort was a non-binary actor and non-binary character. They had a queer relationship, but nothing with how it was written said that we couldn't do that. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't, when we're doing those things, like you said, it's never for the point of like, aha, but did you expect the gays? And it's like, no, like, it's just a natural part of how we work and how we tell stories and how people can see themselves in it. Like that's a huge important part too when you're casting shows in the city. Well, I mean anywhere. But especially like when you're doing a show in the streets of Toronto and people are walking by and you're in the most diverse city in the world, um, people need to look and sound like people from all over the world to be
Yeah.
relevant and to make people who are walking by feel seen and feel like, oh, maybe I can come watch this. Maybe this is interesting for me.
I just think that generally what we put on this stage should reflect the world around us. And so when you're creating theater in the most diverse city in the world, you should the stage should be filled with as many colors of people, nationalities of people, uh, as we see on the street, and that should just be the way it works, and because I think otherwise audiences of color see a show and they say, "I guess this isn't for me."
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, like why would they necessarily want to come and why should we expect a diverse audience if we're not going to put in the work to have a diverse cast and diverse crew, or if we're not going to listen to those people in rehearsal about like,
Mm,
actually, I don't think that my character is going to do that. I don't think me as an actor, as a person, is going believes that this is, how this character is going to approach things. Like that's
yeah.
an important part of it as well, is like you've got to have those people, but you have to also recognize the actual lived experience they're bringing to
Yes.
your show and how
Yeah.
incredibly valuable and important that is. Like that's the whole point of doing it, is to have these other perspectives.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. And those conversations in the rehearsal room are super important to avoid causing harm, which
Yeah.
has historically happened in the theater.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Like we have something that like our founding artistic director, Scott Emerson Moyle, who everybody in the sort of indie theater world will have maybe interacted with at some point. Lucky, hopefully for them. And he kind of started this thing of like a policy of like, there's no assholes in the room. And that's really important to our shows. Like there's no one who's going to be treating anybody badly. There's no one who's not as important as anybody else. And that's sort of evolved to like a more official room agreement, and helping people understand where we're coming from. Like we have been very fortunate to work with in the past and this year actors who are older. And so this year, well, we have like non binary actors and trans actors, and older actors who just have less um, experience dealing with people who are out, because so many people are out now and have not always been. um that, yeah, like making the room agreement together, talking through it and explaining to them how that works, like bringing them into like, this is why we're talking about pronouns and this is why we're really working for that, is really really important and makes like a unified group of people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things, and you sort of like alluded to it, is that Dauntless City Theatre is works on queering Shakespeare. A couple of years ago, I spoke to a number of members of a cast of one of the shows, and we did talk about the importance of queering Shakespeare and what that looks like. Um, you've described Dauntless as being rooted in queering, subverting, and modernizing Shakespeare. Um, do you get pushback from actors when presenting this to them? Do people come to you ready to uh, uh, commit to it, or do people come to you thinking, "Oh, Shakespeare, I'm going to do this," and then have to make drastic changes to their thinking?
I think that at this point, and actually this year was a little bit different because we had had a break and almost every actor we worked with this year was totally new to us. Um, but that also meant they were totally ready. I think initially there was some expectation of, Shakespeare, like for a while, we would have people on auditions who were like very serious, like very serious actors doing very serious Shakespeare. But that has changed. I think that Dauntless really um sort of walked the walk and had a reputation for doing things differently and for willing to listen if somebody thought that something wasn't completely right or what we were going for. And so in general, I find that actors come in not only ready to do the work in a different way, but like excited to, really excited to just be like, oh, we can do this differently. Because there are, with Shakespeare, like Shakespeare scholars and things, people who are so precious about it, but we are just not precious about it. Like we really aren't, because there are enough people doing that. It really doesn't matter. And that's not important to us in the way that we are working.
I totally get you. I remember many years ago, I was doing a production of Midsummer Night's Dream, and one of the lovers, they're talking about, their fathers were there, all this stuff, and was not your father there? Yeah, was not my father here? Yay, and my father is the line. Yay, and my father, and the actor said, yeah, and my father, and it totally brought it home for an audience.
Mm-hmm.
But there were a couple of people who, after this show, were like, did you say, yeah? Like that was the worst thing that you could possibly do. We were doing it in like modern clothing. So it was like, why not? And yet some people get so uptight about those things.
Yeah. And like, why at this? Like, I don't know. I don't think that it matters. And I don't think it does any favors. And I don't think it invites anybody new in. Like, if we're going to be so rigid, like, why would anyone be interested? Or, like we had people work on our show this year who don't have any like cultural history with Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
Like why, I don't know that we should necessarily expect them to really care if we're going to be such jerks about it, like such snobs about it. Like it's the most precious playwright in the entire world. Like no other culture has a great playwright. I think it's silly, but we have,
Yeah.
it's interesting. Like I find our audience is really, really supportive and into it, and even people who don't really expect it. But we do pretty much every year have this one older man who comes with like kind of a folding chair and like the script of whatever we're doing. And just like having the hardest time, like trying to follow the play because we've chopped it up or we've mixed some pieces around. And I'm just like, just put your book away. It's okay, buddy.
Yeah.
Like it's all right.
Yeah. I do think that kind of preciousness, that snobbery around Shakespeare does keep people away.
Yeah.
And again, since a lot of people's first experience with Shakespeare was being poorly taught it in high school, so they're
Yes.
already predisposed to hate it. And then if we approach it from a point where it should only be done in pumpkin pants with a ruff and the big dresses and all this sort of stuff, and we should follow all of these rules about how it should be performed, then we're just confirming that it's not for the people who are already predisposed to dislike it.
Yeah, exactly. That's such an amazing point. And I always tell people like, if you feel like Shakespeare is not for you, Dauntless Shakespeare is for you. Like you will come and you will understand what we're saying and you will understand what's happening. Like it's gonna be fine. But there are so many people who are afraid of it. Like, I have a very close group of friends who are not theater people who I think have seen zero of my Dauntless shows because they're like, Shakespeare, I don't know. And it's like, do you really think that I'm out there making stuffy Shakespeare that you can't see? Like, what are you talking about?
Speaking of theater that sort of like brings people in and brings people together, you were the producer on a production of the Rocky Horror Show, which I think that any theater that's programmed it has found it's like their number one box office draw because it brings in people who are not predisposed to going to theater. It brings in fans of the Rocky Horror Show or the Rocky Horror Picture Show and mixes them with theater goers. And some of those people who are fans of the Rocky Horror Show, they come multiple times.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Like that was something like Caleb, who directed the Rocky Horror Show, he had pitched it to Matt, I think the previous year or something. Like they'd been ruminating on it for a long time before I kind of came in. And I think that the board was really like, I don't know, it's kind of racy. And their supporters, I mean, it's like a rural town. Their supporters are older people who are coming for Norm Foster or whatever. And like, they weren't sure. But they were like, yeah, let's, like, let's do it. The timing was going to be post pandemic. Like, let's have some fun. Let's get some people there. But they did not anticipate the numbers. Like more than 4,000 people saw that show, which is
Mm.
incredible for
Mm-hmm.
here. And like I knew that it would be a huge hit. I've been a huge Rocky Horror fan since I was like 15. And I grew up in this town where that was my only connection to queer culture. That's the only thing that made me feel like there are other people in this universe like me, and they
Mm.
are out there somewhere in Toronto, is what I assumed and was correct. But like they're also here, like not everybody got to leave. And that's also with like the amount of incredible talent here too, is like not everybody left. There are still incredible people here, interesting people here. There's a whole community of people here waiting. And so with the programming that's happening here a lot of the time isn't as exciting. I knew that everyone was going to be like, "Oh my god, there's a play I can go see. I'm going to go see it." But it's funny, like we had people who didn't know they were coming to see a play. Like I chatted in one guy in the lobby
Oh,
after the show one night. Yeah, he thought he was coming to like that there was going to be a screen and we were projecting the movie, which was like, "Oh, okay." Like, yeah, I mean it was a possibility, but yeah, and the mix of people was amazing. Like you had some people like it was really really cool to see, some parents bringing their like queer teenagers to come see it, and you could just see like their excitement to get to see something that felt like it was more for them. And I really felt that. I would have died as a teenager for this show to have existed in Orillia.
oh yeah.
And, like it was beautiful. And it was an interesting mix too, because yeah, you do get like the people who are long time Matt supporters coming to see the show because they come to see every show because they're great, great theater patrons. And then you have all these people who have been watching this movie for 20 years, screaming at their TV in their basement, who don't know how theater works. It's very hilarious, but like really, really fun.
Yeah, I think both. I mean, when Can Stage did it, and also when Stratford did it a few years later, they had signs in the lobby because they knew they were going to be mixing their theater audience and the Rocky Horror audience. I think it was more for their patrons, their regular patrons, to let them know, no, 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 these people are supposed to be shouting. They're supposed to be shouting. Don't get upset. This is part
Yeah.
of the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we sold some little goodie bags with noisemakers and glow sticks and stuff in the lobby for people to kind of have a little bit of control so they're not throwing rice and toast and spoons
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
things, and a little like some warnings here and there in the program to just be like, it's okay. Like that exact same thing. Like this is going to happen. Some people are going to yell things, and the shows were all very different, but it was rare to not have audience participation.
Mm-hmm.
Like that
Mm-hmm.
was really, really big and fun and amazing. I mean, the first opening night when we did Over at the Frankenstein place, and like I turned around to look at the audience, I was sitting very close to the front. And it was just like a sea of like lights from cell phones and glow sticks. And I started crying. It was so emotional. I was like, oh my God, like all these people are here and they're doing the thing. I was so happy.
That's so awesome. That's so awesome. And I imagine that people traveled for this show in a way that they might not for a Norm Foster, that people made a bit more of a journey because that show is that show.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like we did have an incredible sort of social media outreach happening. Shannon, who was in our chorus, also did our publicity, and she just did such a fun campaign. And it brought in it had a huge reach, and it brought in a ton of people. But yeah, from everywhere. People from Newmarket. We had people come from farther north, like Bracebridge, Huntsville, Gravenhurst, multiple times. We had somebody come from Kingston, I think. Like all over the place. Many people from Toronto. Yeah, so that was really really exciting too. Really exciting.
Nice, nice. Now, one of the things that I love to talk about is I love to hear people's theater origin story. Everybody who does theater, whether they're on stage, behind the stage, whether they're producing, doing something, they have a moment where they fell in love with theater and decided that was the thing for them. What was your theater origin story?
My theater origin story, it has like a bit of a weird turn in it. Like when I was in grade 9, the high school I went to, OD in Orillia, of which many of the retired teachers are members of MAT, which is hilarious and weird because I have to try to call them by their first names, and it's weird. Um, now that I'm a grown up. But we did a production of Anything Goes, and that really, really lit something in me. I worked in the costumes, which I absolutely loved, and it really bit me, but it in a way that shifted me to film. Um, where I was just like, this is incredible. This is amazing. I want to do things that are going to last forever. So I was like, movies, that's for me. And I went to film school at Humber. And when I got out of film school, it was like the SARS situation, which had really kind of destroyed the theater industry. But I worked on a few movies, which was great. And in the costume departments on some, which was really, really incredible. Like I got my costumes training and mentorship from Julie Weiss, who's absolutely brilliant. Like she did Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and I think 12 Monkeys and I don't know, a whole bunch of things. And so that was really like unbelievable and exciting. But the jobs just like dried up. Everything went out to the West Coast for a really long time. And during that time, I can't even remember exactly how I got hooked up with this person, but there was a woman doing like a kind of Mae West adjacent show at Buddy's and needed a production manager. And I was like, I can do that probably. So I did that. And I ended up kind of also being the stage manager. And even though that experience was not fantastic, it really was like, oh, this is actually where I want to be. Like when I was working in film, because like I always wanted to have kids, it was very apparent to me like, oh, none of the women I'm working with have children. And there's very good reason for that. It's incredibly difficult. I mean, maybe it's gotten a tiny bit better now. That was a while ago, but I was just like, oh, I don't know how to have a life and have this career. And also the career was very unstable at that point. So I ended up doing theater and loved it and felt immediately, even though I was new, that there was a place for me, a place for my ideas, a community to be had. Like it felt like the hierarchy was far less important in theater than it was on a film set where it was incredibly important. And so from that job, I just kind of met some people at Buddy's who invited me to do another show. And then I worked with Sky Gilbert, which was cool, and a bunch of really amazing, interesting people. And that just kind of kept happening basically forever. Like I just kind of kept getting bounced around people. And then I randomly ended up being roommates with Scott. And he started Urban Bard. And we just were like two halves of the same brain for many, many, many years, which really like solidified my sort of theater life.
Mm. I find it interesting that, you sort of caught the theater bug and you were like, I want things to live forever. So if that's what you want, theater is not going to be it, because you really have to come to terms with the impermanence of theater.
Yeah.
I remember when I was younger, people would, they knew that I wanted to be an actor. So I would get like gifts of like, here's a book about theater. And they would talk about these productions. And I'd be like, well, but I can't see it. Like you're talking about how brilliant this production is. And all I know is that it was brilliant. And I can't, maybe there's a couple of pictures, but I can't see it. And you just have to come to terms with the fact that that's the way theater is. Each day, each night, each performance is in the past. It will never happen that way again.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's a completely different thing. And I think just, I don't know, experience or reflecting on experiences just sort of changed, but I just felt so much more at home in theater. And I still have like a huge love of film. Like that came from my dad would like rent movies with us like every weekend. That's what we always did was watch movies. We didn't have much money. So it was like, we're always going to be at home, like watching a ton of movies all weekend. And like my dad, it's very strange because he chose everything we'd watch. But like every once in a while, like, I don't know, he would say like something about The Godfather and be like, "Oh, I haven't seen The Godfather." And he's like, "What are you talking about? How could you have never seen That's so stupid." And like go and rent it. It's like, but you're the guy. Like if you haven't shown it to me, I haven't seen it. Yeah, so you're right. It's really, really different, but it lives in the people who do it and the
Yeah.
people who have seen it. And even though that can be hard, I mean, there are endless shows like, I mean, working in indie theater and having two kids, I rarely have money to go or time to
Uh,
go see a show.
yeah. Yeah.
So it's weird because you want to see everything and you really just can't. But I just find it even exciting talking to people about like whatever they've been working on or whatever they recently saw. Even if you can't see it, it's like it lives in this weird theater zone that somehow makes it okay. Like, it was so great for the time it was happening. And then you
Yeah.
move on to the next thing that's so great. Like,
Yeah.
it's always sad. My come down from Rocky Horror is terrible. My come down from everything is always like, I'm no good between shows. The first part of the pandemic was very stressful for me because I was just like, yeah, but like, I gotta be doing a show. What's happening here? So it's always sad because you're like, feel like you'll never see those people again. And everybody's always like, oh, we'll get together. And it's not possible because it's like 20 people and you're all going to your next project. But there's just, I don't know, when you work on something that you love and that you've enjoyed with the people that were working on it with you, it's like, I don't know, it feeds your soul in a way that it's like permanent to you.
Yeah. I think that's the thing because I mean we all have been in this situation where because we form these little families that
Mm.
exist for the show, and then we lie to each other and say that we'll get back together. But you eventually, I guess, have to come to terms with the fact that this was a family,
Yeah.
and when the show's over, like we're always going to be happy to run into each other
Mhm.
because of this family, but we're not going to see each other in the same way. We just have to let it go in the same way that we have to let go a show where nobody laughed at the jokes and move on to the next one. It's
Yeah.
the same kind of thing. We just have to allow the impermanence, but it's so hard because the emotions are so strong.
Yeah, yeah, it really, really is. And especially when you get like a short run or you're picking up steam at the end of your run, which was really the case with Slaughter Brothers. Like that show was brilliant and weird. And it was really finding its audience. Like we lost a week. We lost our first week because of COVID. So we only had 2 weekends and it deserved a longer run. Same with Rocky Horror. Like if we could have had another weekend or so, like
Yeah.
it's when things are going well, it never feels like enough time because at the sort of an indie level, like nobody's doing a run for months or years or
Yeah.
whatever. It's gonna be short. And at the time, it rarely feels like enough time, except for maybe Fringe. Often at
Yeah.
Fringe, you're like, okay, this was the best 2 weeks ever, and we're good.
I think that Fringe is a little different because Fringe is so intensely one thing, right?
Yes.
It's like you're
Yeah.
out there, you're promoting, you're doing the show, you're seeing a bunch of shows. It's a whirlwind. And at the end of it, you're like, okay, I'm good. Which is what makes like a Fringe tour like a real roller coaster of you come down, you're like, oh, we're getting into another city, we're going down. Um, but yeah, it's so hard. And I think that also generally in Canada, we don't have long runs. Like there are shows that can and probably should run longer, but we don't have the kind of venue space that some other cities do where a show can get picked up and can run for a long time. Even on the Mervish stages, shows don't tend to run for a long period of times. On the big production company Mervish, for people who aren't from the Toronto area, they do all the big Broadway shows, the huge shows that come to Toronto, and even they have other shows on the schedule, except when they block off a time in a theater. But for the most part, a show can't run indefinitely the way it can, say, in New York or London.
Yeah, yeah, it's absolutely true. And for sort of I don't know, like a mid-level, like Tarragon or Passe Marais or some of these factory that are Soul Pepper, like places, Crow's Nest, like places that are doing some really interesting work. Like this year, I feel like everybody's programming has just been like next level. And of course, I'm in Orillia in Severn, just like, oh my God, like I can't get to the city and see this. What's happening? Um, it would kind of be a shame for things to run a long time because there's so many incredible people and so many incredible theater makers doing really interesting stuff. And if we did book people for months at a time, then there's like 10 other shows that wouldn't be possible. You're right. It's like we just don't have enough space.
I know, and that's the unfortunate balance. And the unfortunate thing is, I feel like that causes us to have a disposable attitude towards some of the theater that we do. We don't. It doesn't get time to breathe. The show can be successful. Yay, the show is successful, and then a year later, it maybe gets a Dora nomination and maybe an award, but it's over and it's forgotten.
Yeah. That
It
is
doesn't
very
have
true.
a chance to run, and that's just space. Tarragon has a whole season that they have to fit in. A show can't run indefinitely just because it's in there. So it's a tough one, and I wish that, wishes. It'd be great if we had more space, that we could afford more space in the city. We could, have more theater that lives on, but it is, theater
Yeah.
scene is what it is,
Yeah, it's really true. It's similar, up here in Orillia at least, like our only spot really like is the Opera House, which has an upstairs theater that's very large. It's I don't know, I think it's close to 700 seats. And they have a studio theater that's around 100. And then Mariposa Arts, they have a warehouse where they do have some space, but they haven't done much. They're going to do some things this spring, which I'm excited about. But yeah, like there's just not a lot of places for things to happen. And so for me, it's been interesting because there's really only a couple of groups, like Mariposa Arts Theater
Yeah,
is doing
yeah,
their thing. And they only have so many people. They can't do more than, 3 or so shows in a year because they're
yeah.
burning out all of their volunteers otherwise.
Mm,
Um, and Arts Orillia is sort of young and just starting. And so they are pacing themselves with how, what they can do because they're funding so many things, residencies and things. That's a little bit at a time. And I'm just sort of sitting here like wishing for a little storefront theater, where I could just be doing some
yeah.
things all the time, even though I have more than enough to keep me busy. It's like I'm always ravenous for like the next project. I'm never content with what I know is lined up. There's always going to be more, which is my own personal hell of my own making.
But if that's the thing that you're passionate about, that makes it not a hell. That's just something that you're imposing on it, that to call it that. Because if it's something you really want, it's not hell.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It is. And I miss it. I do miss like that is a fun thing about Toronto, and having done like a million fringes and so many, especially when I was stage managing so many different
Yeah.
shows, like you mentioned, like working with Adri and like all the people that I've worked with through the years, like doing shows in weird little crevice spaces that are creepy and terrible. But like it's fun, and that's kind of the charm, is like, will we survive this run? Maybe. I don't know. But yeah, the unique venues, like it's easy to miss them, and it's easy to miss the how much opportunity that can provide for people. Like it's difficult because funding is hard and having the money to do a show is difficult. Even when you have storefront theaters, it's not always affordable. But it's something. And when there's so many of them, there are options for people.
Yeah, absolutely. Stevie, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I'm so thrilled to have had this conversation with you.
Yes, me too. I'm so happy we finally, got to chat to each other.
This has been an episode of Stageworthy. Stageworthy is produced, hosted, and edited by Phil Rickaby. That's me. If you enjoyed this podcast and you listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can leave a 5-star rating. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can also leave a review. Those reviews and ratings help new people find the show. If you want to keep up with what's going on with Stageworthy and my other projects, you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to philrickaby.com/subscribe. And remember, if you want to leave a tip, you'll find a link to the virtual tip jar in the show notes or on the website. You can find Stageworthy on Twitter and Instagram at StageworthyPod, and you can find the website with the complete archive of all episodes at stageworthy.ca. If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at philrickaby, and as I mentioned, my website is philrickaby.com. See you next week for another episode of Stageworthy.